You're listening to Speaking Sidemount, the podcast where we talk all things sidemount diving, from equipment, skills, techniques, and sidemount diving expeditions to interviews with some of the world's top sidemount divers. Whether you're new to sidemount, been sidemount diving for years, or just want to know more, this is the place for all things sidemount. I'm your host, Steve Davis. Let's get wet. Hey, welcome back to Speaking Sidemount. I'm Steve Davis. Thank you again to all of you for the many suggestions for guests and subjects for upcoming episodes. Keep them coming and I'll absolutely do my best to follow through on as many of them as make sense. Thanks too for the great feedback on the multi-cylinder sidemount episode. I love sharing this information with you and I'm really pleased that many of you find it useful. I do get asked a lot of questions on the basics of sidemount diving, so just a reminder for those of you who are new to sidemount or want to brush up on the foundational aspects of sidemount diving, my ebook Sidemount Fundamentals covers everything from why you should dive sidemount to equipment, setting it up, putting it in the water, and then the 10 fundamental skills that you should master to be a competent sidemount diver. It is not a substitute for good sidemount training, but it is the manual that I use for my courses, and it's a great reference both pre and post course. Check it out at www.sidemountpros.com in the store. Many thanks to Rebecca Barrett from Canada, who introduced me to my guest this week, Peter Norris. Peter's a cave explorer from Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada. Now, Rebecca mentioned that Peter was involved in some pretty cool projects and had discovered a unique cave system on Vancouver Island called Wet Dreams. So with that, I just had to find out more. Peter's a caver who became a sump and cave diver to extend his capabilities in exploring cave systems. Sidemount was an absolute necessity in this, not only to enable him to pass restrictions, but also to allow him to carry dive equipment through dry cave passages to reach the next sump. Now in this week's episode, we discuss Peter's background in caving, his progression to cave diving and sidemount diving, and we delve into his exploration projects. We each recount stories of getting trapped and how we dealt with that. We talk decompression, and to top it off, we share our thoughts on AI for technical and sidemount diving. All this and much more in this week's episode of Speaking Sidemount. Peter, welcome to Speaking Sidemount.
Thanks, Steve. Good to be here.
Peter, I learned of you through one of our listeners, and I'm really interested in just learning a bit more about your background in diving.
My background in sidemount and cave diving is that I'm a caver who dives. So back in the 1980s, I carried tanks for a bunch of divers. And after a few years of that, I got old and it became my turn. You probably heard this before. So this was 1988. I'd been caving for a few years. I was 37 years old, so not a young fellow, but some new things for me. So I went out with a buddy of mine, the infamous Peter Norris, who's a well-known caver to perhaps a previous generation. Right. And we got certified as PADI open water divers. 24 open water dives later, I'm doing some sump diving in northern Vancouver Island. Not a route that I or anybody should recommend, but that's the way it was back then.
Sure.
Really, I'm a sump diver, and my background is in sort of semi-alpine, crawling around stuff, sometimes with no fins on, often small. We have found a couple of larger things up here that I'd be glad to talk about, but really I'm a sump diver who's proud of it. Wish I had the advantages that divers coming up now do have. But I was mentored in kind of the British tradition.
Yes.
In that it was more about getting in there and getting the survey or making the connection or doing what you've got to do. I'm sure you can imagine just how bad our gear was.
I think some of that persists to this day because you look at some of the guys in the CDG and they're absolutely phenomenal cave divers. And yet, if I compared their equipment to the configurations that we consider normal in sidemount, they're far, far from that. And I was just interviewing Andrew Goring from Sump UK earlier today. And he sort of mentioned most of them love to build their own equipment at home. So kind of like that, I think they find a problem in the cave. They say, okay, let's overcome that. I'll make something in the back shed, and then next week it's in the water.
Well, that's right. And that's what we did for years and years. And it made sense. It particularly made sense when we're basically crawling through things.
Yeah.
Quite often, our version of Sidemount was any way of attaching tanks to you that you could take them on and off. because you quite often had to push them in front of you or do what you needed to do. And buoyancy, those sorts of things were quite secondary.
Yes.
And my harnesses to this day quite often are very simple things, depending on the dive, of course. But I did some dives in Wyoming a couple of years ago. And you'd think with the passage of time, much more elaborate gear would be the thing to go for. But a couple of us had was just some straps to hold some weights on their shoulders, a couple of D-rings on the weight belt, and away you go.
Yeah, sure.
Because it really was a sump.
Yep.
However, I have had the experience of getting into something that was a bit larger and then discovering that perhaps me in my wetsuit with no BCD, a little bit too much weight.
Not as good an idea as it seemed at the beginning of the dive, right? So
you're basically swimming uphill the whole time.
There's a thing that they say about living and learning, right? I interviewed Nat Gibb from Under the Jungle in Mexico a few weeks ago, and one of the points that Natalie made was when she gets students who come to her these days, because now as a dry caver you can go and get great cave diving training, which probably wasn't available way back in the 80s. And she made the point that she sees two types of students. She sees the students who are divers, who have a proficiency at diving, but then want to become cave divers. And she talked about the sort of things that she needs to teach them about learning about the cave, as opposed to necessarily just learning about diving. And then she mentioned the contrast with the dry cavers that she was instructing, where they were fantastic in understanding the geology and the geography of a cave and how a cave goes. And she had to teach them diving. So it was quite a contrast.
I bet it'd be a bit of a struggle for her, I'm sure. What do you need to know, huh? Until recently, I don't think anybody taught sump diving. I'm not sure even now if sump diving is really at the top of the list. So and Natalie's awesome. I've met her, and she's a wonderful person and puts on a good show. And her accomplishments are manifold, of course. She's teaching people at a higher level than any of us ever even knew we could aspire to. And it's wonderful. I dive with a bunch of her students.
Yes.
And they are fantastic. They're all much more squared away divers than I am. And there you go. But I still seem to get out on the big caving trips more than they do. So,
well, as I said, there's the people who actually end up thousands of meters underground and hundreds of meters underwater, thinking of Harry and Craig Challen and those sort of guys. And then there's those who have been through some of the modern training. And I think, look, the world is changing, and the level of sidemount diving now compared to 10 years ago even is much higher. Everything's forgiven when you're going in there and doing exploration projects. So it sounds like sidemount was kind of a necessity for the sump diving that you were doing. Tell us a little bit about sort of how you used sidemount in the early days and how it supported your cave exploration.
Pretty obvious it was sidemount or nothing for us. Most of the caves, not all of them, but most of the cave prospects were pretty small. We're talking about resurgences or sumps in between sections of dry cave. So quite typically we would have to carry stuff. It would be axiomatic that you had to be able to survey before anybody would support you for a dive, because you're caving and making a record. We're cave explorers. We kind of just looked around and made things up. I come from a climbing background and had made climbing harnesses for quite a while and other climbing equipment that wasn't readily available. And so it was just natural to pick up the sewing machine and stitch something up. So as I mentioned earlier, it was more just a way to hang tanks and perhaps bungee on some regulator someplace. It needed to be something that was really rugged, very small, and that you could put on lying in a cave passage that maybe was a bit too small for a normal, put something over your head. So our requirements were different than most cave divers would be looking at getting used to now. And they remain a little bit different. The summer before last, we did a number of things up here. One was the deepest cave dive that's been done in Canada. We got down to 300 feet, or at least my dive partner did. After we worked on moving boulders for a couple of days, 5-degree water with ropes all over the place. I spent far more time in the water than he did, but of course he gets the credit for actually getting down to 300 feet. But it was really tiny. And, I had to take off one of my 45 Sidemount to get through. The entrance was just that small, even after all of our work. We then went on to another project called the White Rabbit in a mountain range in British Columbia. We flew in by helicopter. To get down to the sump there was 10 pitches. So you had to be able to rappel with your gear, and it had to be able to arrive functioning at the other end, and you had to be able to get it on and where you were and away you go. So sometimes the niceties weren't really the most important thing.
I guess they're great skill sets to go together, aren't they? Climbing and caving and then ultimately the cave diving, because there's no other way to do it, is there? If there isn't a member of your team who can move the equipment around, get it into the right place, then basically can't do it, can you?
No, that's right. You need to be a climber, caver, and have an idea about what you're going to do when you get there. Be able to deal with equipment failures, be able to knock things up in a way that will be, not life-threatening, but life-sustaining, hopefully. And, well, that was normal, and it still is. However, I've had the opportunity to be in some nicer caves, and I think cave diving is really a lot more fun than some diving.
I tend to agree, yeah. There's a few parts to it. Number one, it's the sheer difficulty of getting equipment, as we just said, through sumps and dry sections into the diving part. And then there's the ability to move through really tight restrictions, and you compare that to some of the aircraft hangar type caves that are around with crystal clear water and the ability to see fantastic formations and speleotherms and so on. So, I mean, certainly that's the cave diving I love to do, but it only occurs in very specific places, doesn't it?
That's right. I think we have one cave like that in BC that we just found a few years ago. Most of our caves are you climb or fly into them, and I'm smallish, and smallish has been good.
Yeah. Natalie and I talked about that as well. She's a small woman, and I'm not a big guy either. So I get a lot of comfort out of the fact that if somebody big has been through before me, then it's a lot easier than if you're necessarily poking your head in somewhere for the first time, right?
Yeah. No, I've been stuck a few times. It's a funny feeling. I once jammed myself into a restriction up at about our maximum depth. I think we're about 140 feet.
Right.
I think 4 or 5 sumps in, and it was the old days with yoke valves, and I knocked off our first stage.
Oh.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it was the one I was breathing off of, and more unfortunately, I was looking up at some gravels that were lying at the angle of repose from the winter storms. Yes. And of course, when the gas blew up, it just instantly buried me. So there I was, buried under the gravel with nothing to breathe, with air, and stuck still.
Let's talk about that for a second, because you laugh now, but obviously it's not much fun at the time. And I've got a similar experience, so maybe we'll contrast them. I got trapped inside a wreck, and it wasn't for a long time, and I don't think it was anywhere near as serious as what you were talking about, but I was genuinely stuck, and I had to go through a real process to get myself out of that. Let's talk about it, because I think it's interesting for the listeners to understand that it's not a matter of when an issue happens or if an issue is going to happen. It's a matter of when it's going to happen. And so what process did you go through to get yourself out of that situation?
Well, interesting question. I certainly have thought about it a lot. I nearly died that day. I had a partner with me. A lot of our dives are done solo, but that day I had somebody with me who was behind me, saw my fins flapping around, but had no idea that I was in trouble. And I was just a breath away from, So what did I do? Well, first of all, I thought, I should panic. And then I thought, well, maybe not. Yep. I was truly jammed in there. I'd made a mistake. I'd put a battery in the middle of my harness, in the middle of my back. Yep. And it seemed like an out-of-the-way spot, but it wasn't out of the way enough. And then I did the manly thing, which was when I got stuck, just kind of gave her to see if I could just sort of force myself through. Yep. So there was a couple of mistakes. And of course, we've moved on from yoke valves for cave diving. For us, it was shortly after that incident. But basically, I didn't lose it. I don't know what else to say. I had one arm in front of me, one arm behind me. I really was tight. I weigh 135 pounds, so it was a small spot. And I just hit it at the wrong place. So I just thought, well, I've got to preserve gas, and I've got to get a reg in my mouth, and I got to get unstuck. So, you just wiggle, just don't stop. Don't stop. Mm-hmm. Get that reg in your gob at the same time as you're turning the other tank off.
Yes.
I don't know if I'll say anything to my credit. It was that we weren't diving to thirds. I turned the dive long before thirds because it was a really creepy place. And I just had this tap on my shoulder that said, you need to get out of here. And I needed that gas, it turned out, because I threw half a tank away in a matter of seconds. So what I did to get out of it is I didn't panic. I wriggled down until I could do one thing, and then the next thing, and then the next thing. And then I discovered at that moment that you can actually reattach your first stage underwater. Doesn't do it any good at all.
Well, it can go for a service, right?
You're lying there, and it's kind of like, try it or don't try it. I tried it, and then, it worked. I basically threw those rigs away after that trip, but there you go. So don't ever give up. You hear stories of people writing notes when they've run out of gas.
Yeah, what a waste of time. Yeah.
Don't do that.
No, I hear you. In my interview with Joel Heineth, we talked about this from a conceptual point of view as well. And you said it in almost exactly the same way that she did. And it was about getting little wins along the path to success. So the first thing was, hey, I've got a big problem and I may not get home today. Then her conversation was along the lines of, well, hey, emotions, you're not going to help me right now. So get out of the way while I think this through. You're removing yourself from that panic situation. And then you need to knock some things over in order. And the first order of business is I need to breathe. So find a breathable gas. The second order of business is get myself out of this situation. And so how am I going to do that? And mine was extraordinarily similar. I moved into a section of a shipwreck that I hadn't been in before. And I went down a path by accident. And I was in 3 cylinders in Sidemount and it turned on my side. It was very tight. I should have been able to move through, but I became entangled. And I wasn't sure what I was entangled on. It was behind me and I'd lost my buddy. So I had a situation very similar where I'm trapped. I had plenty of gas, so that wasn't my problem. My problem was that I couldn't figure out how to disentangle myself. And it took quite a bit of time and thoughts. And as you said, the first thing that happens is the panic starts to well up and your breathing increases. And of course, we know what happens when your breathing increases. I was at 30 odd meters, 31 meters. So we're working meters versus feet there, but a little over 100 feet. And, as you start to overbreathe at that depth or at any depth for that matter, CO2 builds up and we know the effect that has on us. So, and I think it's interesting for our listeners just to think that through and understand that if you get into trouble, there is a process. And the first thing is bring yourself under control. And the second thing is in order, can I breathe? And then start solving problems and get your little wins along the path to success that Jill spoke about.
It's funny, years later, just a few years ago, I got stuck with my rebreather exploring a cave about 140, 50 feet deep. So not deep, but deep enough.
Sure.
Back in a cave in a side passage, doing some surveying. My partner was off surveying another side passage. It should have been pretty straightforward. And I managed just to get tangled up in something. I'd had a piece of gear break. I'd had a door handle fall off my butt plate. So I put a piece of string there. I clipped my tank, one of my bailout tanks, to the piece of string. And when I got tangled up in my own line in this really tiny, tight passage that really I shouldn't have been in there with my rebreather and 2 bailout tanks, but there you go. Managed to get all tangled up and clipped off to the line,
If it can get tangled, it will, right?
and there I was. But it's funny, I didn't even get that excited. My partner could hear me smashing this, what we call an inclusion, basically a bit of hard rock sticking to the limestone with my aluminum 80 because I was trying not to cut the line.
Yeah.
And so I'm bashing this thing with a tank, and he said it sounded like somebody was pile driving down there. Yeah, and I'm not succeeding. So eventually I had to cut the line and then figure it out, yada, yada, yada. But I don't think my breathing rate even went up. I just was mad.
Was this after the first occurrence or before?
Oh, long after.
Long after.
Decades later.
It's interesting. Yeah, Bogarts talks about this as well. When I interviewed Steve, he talked about comfort zones. Dives he's doing today would have killed him 15 years ago. And it's kind of like, but once you go through that experience, you're kind of ready to meet it again. Hopefully you learn from the first one, don't make the same mistakes. But at the same time, when you get in that situation, your comfort zone has moved forward somewhat, or at least your ability to deal with it.
Yeah, it's like having your primary light go and you think, oh, that's a nuisance.
Yeah.
But you've got several other lights.
Sure.
And I've had the experience where I lost my primary light and I surveyed for another hour because, I had work to do. But that would have been the end of the dive a few decades ago. It would have just been, the primary light's gone. You got to get it.
Turn the dive.
Yeah. So, and I'm not suggesting you shouldn't turn the dive. I just made,
well, again, it's where your comfort zone is, right? Most of us would say, hey, once I get my primary piece of equipment fails, it's time to turn. You might say, hey, that happened to me once. Maybe I carry a primary and a backup primary along with my 2 other lights. And so I'm ready for one of those to fail. Of course, you can carry too much gear too, can't you? So
you can. I had a friend who always wanted to add another second stage because it made him feel better.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing on that. It's a really interesting area to explore is when things don't go right for us as divers, how do we deal with it? So thank you for sharing from your experience. I enjoyed that. Tell us a bit about diving in BC in general and what it's like.
Well, it's very good. I live in Vancouver, the major city. We've got about half the population of the province down here. And of course, when you have most of the people around, the best diving is not in my backyard. It's not terrible. I go diving when I'm not working. I'll be diving a couple or 3 times a week. So there's something worth doing. It's coldish. It's, I think it was 40, 45, 46 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm sorry. I should use Celsius, but there you go. I don't think that's really cold, but it's coolish. I think
it's maybe 8 or 9.
Yeah, something like that. About 8, I think. And I do dive Sidemount in the ocean, and I do also dive my rebreather. For the longer dives, I use suit heat, and it's kind of nice. And with the rebreather, I'm doing dives up to several hours, just depending on what's going on. With the Sidemount, not so much. So I don't tend to use the suit heater there. However, if you're going for critter diving, you really don't need to go deep.
Right.
So, Sidemount's perfect. Sidemounts become very, very popular and very suitable for a lot of the diving we do here. And it's suitable for a couple of reasons. One is you've got people who, if they're well enough trained, they can drag a couple of aluminum 80s down some fair distance, down a cliff bank, across a field, to some remote location, and then you've got a decent dive ahead of you, not just the old aluminum 80 1 hour at 70 feet max. They can do quite a decent dive. So really get to enjoy that. It's also kind of seems to be easier on people's backs than humping the twin set or whatever. So we have awesome diving, particularly Vancouver Island. Anywhere up and down the coast of Vancouver Island is just fabulous. We got some of the best cold water diving in the world. I was just at a resort in a place called Quadra Island for a few days of diving, and it was beautiful. After I started diving in caves, I took to diving in the ocean. And and it's quite brilliant. It really is. A lot of my friends are good photographers. I used to take photos for the caving stuff. And now my friends' photo equipment is worth more than my rebreather. So I'm sort of letting them take pictures. As a result, I'm getting more pictures of me around. So there you go. Good. But diving here is good. You've got to be equipped for the cold. Most of the dive operators now have gotten used to Sidemount divers. It's not a big deal. People need to learn how to do it. Some people will try and walk around with their aluminum 80 strapped on, and perhaps it's too much. It just depends on the boat, how best you can get in. But most of my friends have become quite adept. It's really good. It gives you a kind of a margin. You've got more gas.
Yeah, I hear that. You either got longer dive or bigger contingency or both. And so, awesome.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Vancouver Island, and I was aware of your wet dream cave exploration and project. That sounded really interesting. Tell us a bit about that.
It's a very nice cave. It's probably the nicest cave in Canada. I'm not at all biased. It's I've been looking for it for a while. I'd heard there was talk. Been an active caver since for quite a while now. And I've been to that valley several times, and there was no evidence. And the reason for that is quite interesting. It's a very short valley called the Nomash River Valley that is a large creek or small river most of the year. The only times the cave appears or the water disappears is during the summer or the winter when the water is either solid or the snow is gone. What happens is the water is flowing along over granite, suddenly hits a patch of limestone, and in the middle of summer, the end of summer, it disappears for about 3.5 kilometers underground.
Right.
I could make it sound like I found it, but of course, the truth is there was a couple of local cavers who've been trying to get us to go and have a look at it for a while.
Sure.
And one nice old fellow called Larry Henson basically dragged me and another cave diver called Richard Jack in America, Seattle, a very good cave diver. We had a look and poked our heads in and couldn't quite believe it because it's quite a small resurgence, not tiny by some standards, but if you're all geared up, it's pretty hard to get in there. Generally, you have to sort of push your tanks down a slope through an opening. Let's see if I can do it in meters, maybe 2.5 meters wide and 1 meter high.
Right.
Goes down to about 20 feet of depth where the cave passage is phreatic. And is 3 to 8 meters in diameter for the first 300 and something meters. Shallow, easy, big, gorgeous, no silt, very unlike Vancouver Island cave diving.
Yeah.
And wow, that's about as far as we got on our first dive on a couple of small
you mentioned it's a resurgence. Was there flow or much flow in there?
Oh, yeah, there was a lot of flow the first time we went in. Yeah, it was a little bit too much flow. The flow was such that on my little steel 45s, we got to a spot where it dropped down deeper. It seemed like the right time to call the dive. I was getting towards thirds, and really, by the time I got out 5 minutes later, I could hardly tell the difference on my gauges.
Quite fun rocketing out. I mean, that's the fun part of flow cave diving. I haven't done a lot of it, but I dive Ginny Springs in Florida, and
yeah, it's like Ginny.
My training in Mexico and Spain, and nearly zero flow caves, and to then go to Ginny Springs and drag your way in and think, gee, this is hard work, but boy, on the turnaround, it's like flying, right?
Yeah, fortunately, it doesn't stay like that. When the water levels went down just a little bit further, the flow became kind of nominal.
Right.
So we explored the thing. We've had all kinds of configurations in there. It's a nice large cave, so you can dive anything you want, from your Florida classic twin set to whatever. Lots of Sidemount divers have been there. Right now, we've got about 6,000 feet of surveyed passage. It's about 3,500 feet to the back. Mm-hmm. Quite a few of the side passages are only accessible by Sidemount. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Can you see this?
Yeah, I can. Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah. It's just for the listeners, complete cave map here with photographs and some nomenclature there about who's explored and the depths and so on. That's fantastic.
Yeah. It's a nice cave. The very, very friendly. By the time we were wrapping up exploration, our dives are getting into the 5-hour range with an hour and a half of decompression, and that gets a bit old in the sort of coolish water we have.
A bit.
Yeah, but you deal with it. You're lying there saying to yourself that you'll never do it again, you're never going to do it again, never do it the next day.
It's funny how that you put that behind you and move on, right?
Yeah, you got to be sort of dumb to be a cave diver. So that's a real cave dive in British Columbia, and it's worth doing. It really is. It's only accessible in August through maybe October, depending practical purposes. Okay. And I can't say enough good things about it. It's not my usual fare. It's more likely that I'll be in some gucky little thing with maybe fins on, maybe not, but that's okay.
How accessible is it in terms of getting to the cave entrance?
It's, I'm going to say about 2.5 hours of fairly decent gravel back roads. Mm-hmm. There's no community there. There's nothing there. There's no support.
But you can effectively drive in with your equipment as opposed to carrying it in.
Well, you have to carry the last 200 meters. But it's by our standards, that's a walk in the park. Yeah. The GEW guys complain a bit about it because they've got their massive twin 130s, but the Sidemount divers hardly notice it at all.
And of course, in some parts of the world, there's people you can hire to take gear in for you, but it doesn't exist everywhere, does it?
Well, you could probably hire people up here, but you'd have to, that's not our style. No. Although I got to say, when I say that, we would never have explored it without the help of our drive caver buddies. So I should be careful there. Without the support of some very good close friends, they were repaid in beers and steaks and things like that.
Fair enough. It sounds like a fair exchange. Awesome. Well, I'll add that one to the list then. Now, I read in your profile that you're involved with the Artificial Reef Society of BC, and I have no idea what that is all about, so I'd love to hear more about it.
I'm not important, but I'm one of many, many volunteers who helped strip out the old warships that have been sunk in various places around the coast. It must be half a dozen of them now in various places. There's a couple in just near Nanaimo, BC. Mm-hmm. There's one that's been sunk quite recently, just near Vancouver, that you can get to with a short boat ride. Yes. And they are fantastic. They are, it's not real wreck diving. Everybody takes and teaches wreck diving courses on them, which is fine. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. It's great that they do that. But they've been sanitized, certainly. There's openings cut in the hull all over the place. Sure. And most of the crummy stuff is taken out, and they're not draped in fish nets like our real wrecks are. But the latest ones that we've done are at recreational depths, or perhaps the deepest bits are a little bit deeper. It's a great place to go diving. It's very interesting watching the latest ones become habitats for sea life. It's just fantastic.
Oh, it's amazing, isn't it? I'm glad I asked about it now without researching, because I'm not sure if you're aware, I spent 14 years in the Navy as an engineer officer, and part of that I served on several ships in New Zealand that are now dive wrecks. And one
cool.
of them in the Bay of Islands, very close to where I'm living here, is the Canterbury wreck. And I found myself in a situation where I dived it a lot. The operator is fantastic, and they did all the stripping out work and the sinking of it. And they were very, very familiar with the ship. However, I got super frustrated every time I went there with people calling compartments by the wrong name and not referring to the ship in the correct way. So I thought, I've got to fix this. So I wrote a book on, number one, the history of it and background, and then on how to dive it, because I love wreck diving. I cave dive, but I get more opportunity to dive wrecks than anything else. Some old salts and sailors and so on feel a bit disheartened when their ship is sunk as a dive wreck, but I think it's absolutely the best use of a ship when it's at the end of its life. The alternative is it goes for scrap. And when you think about what happens when you sink these ships properly, is they do become artificial reefs, and the marine life that surrounds the Canterbury wreck now is unbelievable. They have what we call a rahui, which is an indigenous reserve status on it, so it's a no-take zone. It's just full of every type of marine life you could think of, from invertebrates. It's encrusted in jewel anemone. There's what we call crayfish or lobster all over it, big reef fish, the predators, snapper and kingfish, all the way through to all the bait fish. It's full of big eyes inside, which are kind of always found in caves and sea caves. So it's unbelievable. And one of the things I love about this wreck, you mentioned that they're not real wrecks because they have holes cut in them, and that's actually quite true. What they've done with this one is they've left a certain amount of the equipment in, so a lot of the machinery and the machinery spaces is in there. Those areas do not have as many holes cut, and they're genuine advanced wreck dives. So you're in a real overhead. There is no escape. You must use the techniques and equipment that are required for that. And yet some of the upper decks, so from 2 deck and above, are more open. And so if you're a wreck level diver, you can dive it. I'm still reluctant to recommend people go in single cylinders, but a single and a pony where you have some redundancy, yes, and with the right training. And so we can do everything from line laying in there through to using all of the techniques you'll use in wreck diving. And I just love it, and I love to see that happen. The only thing I do say with some of them is they get way too sanitized. In Malta, all of the wrecks there are completely stripped out. There's really nothing to see, and you're inside the skeleton of a vessel. And I think that's the wrong way to do it. You've got to leave things of interest inside them so that when you're diving it, you say, oh, yes, I can see what that was. Some of the radar displays and some of the seats and equipment and furniture and so on. And the diesel generators are still inside Canterbury. All the main machinery, or most of it, is still there. So it's a terrific dive.
Oh, that sounds great, Steve. Similar here, the latest ship that we sunk, she was formerly called the Annapolis.
Yes, I know the Annapolis. Yeah,
do you?
Yeah, absolutely. I know. Yeah, a destroyer, and I think I remember the class of ship as well. I may have even on Canterbury have spent some time working with that ship. So it's a similar era. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not that old because it was commissioned in my lifetime and decommissioned also, but it was certainly the end of its life. And so when we stripped it out, I would have liked to have left more, to be honest with you. But a lot of the machinery is still down in the bowels of is still there. You have to have your shit ticket. Excuse my language. You have to have your to go down there. Yeah, that's not a place for everybody. But the upper deck's much more clear. You lay some line, pick some line up, put lines on top of other lines, learn all about
what to do and what not to do.
Yeah, and it's really a perfect place for a couple of aluminum 80s. It really is. It's just the sort of the right depth, and you've got that margin that you really do require. And it's not a matter of going down there and getting away with a dive on it, right? You're down there, you're turning it at a certain point, and it's just, I think it's really advancing the skills of our new advanced divers, if that makes sense, because they're being taken there and shown real work. I love it that they're getting a sense of that. But also that they got enough air to get into trouble. Now they got to stay out of trouble.
Yeah, indeed. It's a funny thing, isn't it? Because in the old days, we did what we did because that's all we knew or that's all we had, equipment-wise and so on. I mean, I started diving in the 70s, so maybe a similar time to you. And I certainly, what we had back then versus now is day and night. And what was considered good practice back then compared to now is, again, quite different. So doing a 40-meter plus dive on a single cylinder of gas is not a good idea. Going into an overhead environment with a single cylinder of gas is not a good idea. And we know that now. We know better. So, and it's easy enough to sling a pony, or we should say side mount a pony, shouldn't we, to be able to dive these effectively. So I don't see that should be a barrier, and it's easy enough to go and do a deep specialty and a wreck specialty and get yourself prepared for that sort of environment. Yeah,
training is so good now. You mentioned my friend Rebecca Barrett. She is a fabulous diver and instructor, full cave certified by Natalie. The caliber of teaching that she and her colleagues are able to dispense. There was nothing like that, of course, when we were learning how to dive. And it wasn't that we got bad instruction, it just didn't exist. So you watch me in the water, I'm okay. I can sort of handle tanks and I get away with it. But the new hot shots, they're just beautiful.
Oh,
They're so smooth. And they're passing those high standards on. And I just love it. I just absolutely love that the standards, not just for equipment, but the more important standards for the actual diving and training are just so much better.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And then Natalie's part of that. And then what I experienced in Gozo with Audrey Cadell and Tom Steiner, and then there's Patrick Weidman, and the list goes on and on. Some of the European guests I've had with Thomas Mischera, who is about the most stable diver on the planet, I'm certain. So having these role models, but then when you talk to someone like yourself who's out there really doing some of the sharp pointy end of exploration, understanding that there's a place for this high level of skill, but also that when you're taking things into those environments, sometimes the environment dictates what you're going to do and you compromise to make sure that you can do the job. So there's that dichotomy between the two, I think.
Well, one of the things that sort of bothers me is it's really true that muscle memory is important. Absolutely. You want to reach your hand up and find your stage or your whatever. Mm-hmm. However, you got to know what's going on.
Yeah.
And so situational awareness is kind of everything. And so I wouldn't take anything away from somebody who's suggesting that you really need to know where your stuff is and to put it in the same place. All those kinds of things in muscle memory and practice.
Yeah.
But know what's going on. Know what's going on around you. Where were you just? Where is your buddy? All those kind of things. From experience, you got to figure it out.
Indeed. I agree completely. There's one thing about training and getting to a certain level, and then there's being aware of yourself and of your team and of your environment. So one of the things when you talked a little bit about diving deeper, and I was recalling a conversation with Richard Harris that I had with him in truck about their experiences and diving Pierce Resurgence. I think they got to 220 meters.
Yeah.
It's crazy, right? But what I was interested in, I do a lot of decompression diving, just to the normoxic trimix level, but I do it a lot. Almost all of my dives are decompression dives. So I'm very interested in what's going on with that, and I follow the work of Dr. Simon Mitchell really closely. And most of us here, at least most of the divers I know, are using Borman 16 with gradient factors. And so I asked Harry, I said, listen, what are you guys using? And they're using exactly the same algorithm with gradient factors. And we sort of talked about that for a while. And I said, how does it work out for you? In fact, it worked really well until they got to the shallow depths, where they found through experience that they needed to modify their stops from about 12 meters to the surface, but they were building habitats. I found that really interesting because a lot of the exploratory decompression divers, I might call them, some of the early days, I know they were writing their own tables. And just for our listeners, Peter mentioned off mic that he'd built some of his own tables. So I'm interested in your experience in managing deeper dives where either the tables didn't exist or where you found that they weren't good enough or they didn't work for the dives that you were doing.
Well, back in the early 90s, we were exploring a cave called Salton River Rising. It's quite a small resurgence cave on the west coast of Vancouver Island. Very pretty, but tiny. It's not big or deep by any standards these days, but back then it was pretty big for us. We got in about half a kilometer. Some of it was really small even for me. My dive buddy and I, Pat Shaw, very, very accomplished sub diver up here, would alternate. One day, one of us would stage a tank or two in there, and the person would do the push dive and back and forth. Mm-hmm. And this was a place that we couldn't drive to either. So we carried our stuff down an overgrown grid, on and on and on. We're pretty isolated, getting kind of deep. But the point of all of this is that the cave passage just went down at an angle.
Yeah.
We had newly acquired Aladdin Pro dive computers, but of course you couldn't use them for accelerated decompression. We weren't yet using helium. What we would do sometimes is on the way back up, ditch the Aladdin Pro, just take it off and drop it, and then carry on the decompression with tables, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. But the tables we made up were pretty modest. I just simply drew a line in the shape of the cave and made these overlays of the Navy tables on it and then kind of colored it in with different colored crayons and then added it up and added a conservation factor, which probably meant that we were taking way too long to decompress. Yeah. And the water was about 4. So
right, which doesn't help.
No, so you're lying there for way too long. We took a big storage bottle of oxygen into the 20-foot stop And we had bottles of argon in there to faff around. You'd inflate your suit and deflate your suit and inflate your suit. And just the moving around kept you a bit warmer while you were trying to...
Did you find that you were spending too long at the deeper stops and on-gassing too much? Or what was the issue apart from duration?
Well, it's just duration. We had no way of understanding deep stops, shallow stops. That came much more recently. It was made up and we were way too conservative. We were borderline hypothermic, absolutely every dive.
Yeah.
And it was awful. Thank goodness for sheer water.
Yeah.
The new computers are just astonishing. I always have a couple of computers on me now.
How cool is that company? I met Bruce and Lynn.
Vancouver company.
I know they are. I know that. I've met them in truck and had a chance to have a chat to them both. And then I've got to know Gabrielle recently as well. And I'm doing a little bit of work for them around air-integrated transmitters. So actually, we didn't even talk about that because it's a topic they're interested in. And when Shearwater came up with AI, they thought it would be a recreational type tool. And what they're finding is that tech divers are really, I won't say flocking to it, but they're starting to use the transmitters both on rebreathers and also in Sidemount. And some of the barriers that we all thought might be there, we've got tried and true technology in SPGs, but the ability to have your gas pressures right there in front of you and displayed is impressive. And so I'm interested in your thoughts on that because there is a dichotomy again between failure and trust in a system like this.
I'm going to be buying in your Shearwater just in order to get the transmitters soon. Got a couple of them. My old Predator is getting a bit long in the tooth, but it works perfectly. So it goes on most dogs, but I'd like a smaller, newer. I was really skeptical. I really was. And I see them on friends' wrists and I see the potential. It makes a lot of sense. It's becoming pretty clear that the transmitters they're reliable now. They're not a big problem. The big question about whether you back it up with an SPG or not, I'm just not sure. I'm not sure how I would use it. I make sure that I do a fair bit of sidemount diving every year, and that's probably where I would use it more than with my rebreather. Just because I have the rebreather. When I get the new computer, I'll probably use it if I can get it to tuck away well enough. I think it has potential in ways that I haven't really thought through. One of the project in northern BC, I want to go back to this here where we're down about 300 feet. It's a rebreather dive, really it is, but keeping track of things, I think the transmitters have some potential.
Sure.
Because you're talking about offboard tanks of various descriptions in various places, and I don't want to get too tangled up in the logistics of that dive, but it's just so freaking small. And it's a side mount dive, but a side mount rebreather dive. Getting enough bailout gas in that cave and keeping track of it is going to be an interesting challenge. So I think it's fantastic. I'm not a quick adopter. I don't have it yet, but I haven't really felt the need, but I'm feeling it. It's coming on.
Yeah.
I see it. And people that I trust have surprised me. People that I trust have adopted the transmitters in the new computer and using it in ways you wouldn't think of. So
yeah. I found the whole discussion interesting, and a little bit like you when it first came to me. You sort of start at the level of do we trust a transmitter, and so that's the first point. You think, well, I'll back it up with an SPG, and then as you dig into it deeper, you think, well, you're backing it up with an SPG. All you're really doing is introducing another failure point. And why do you feel the need to back it up? You don't back your SPG up right now, and the SPG can certainly fail during a dive as well. And it does indeed have a couple more failure points than a transmitter does. So you've got the O-ring where it screws into the first stage, and you've also got the swivel where the gauge itself is. So do they fail very often? No, they don't, but they can. And then, of course, if an SPG fails on a dive, generally that would, well, not generally, that would be a sign to turn that dive. And so if a transmitter fails, the same protocol to that and turn your dive. So you don't want to be doing that often or at all, to be honest. So can you trust the transmitter? Really is the point.
Well, fewer mechanical parts.
Yeah.
That's got to be a winner. The transmitter fails, it's just going to stop transmitting. It's going to not start leaking. Anybody who's been diving for a while has had the little champagne bubbles from their SPG, and it's like, oh, well, fix it now, fix it later.
Well, and I made the point in discussing this with Nat Gerber was, look, let's think of a cave dive for the moment. Provided you haven't breached a gas rule, so provided you're still within thirds or fourths or whatever you're diving, if it fails and you turn, you've got plenty of gas to get out, provided you're not hemorrhaging gas. And if you are, it's an HP leak, which is not as bad as an LP leak. So
exactly. People go on and on about various things that what might happen, but just don't understand why people run out of air. Sorry, but long hoses and all that stuff are all very fine and dandy, but come on, for me, I'm a little guy, and when I start stacking a few tanks on me, it's kind of hard to spot everything. I see me being able to continue to swim without having to look down or look around or lose my concentration.
Sure.
Never mind scootering, where all bets are off. You're just rushing along there.
Well, certainly for me, to be honest, when I'm scootering and checking a gas pressure, I stop.
It's usually a good idea.
Have a look. Okay, go. So, because yes, you're right, and it's asking for trouble in an accident. Your mind's off the job while you're scootering. So having it right in front of you, unbelievable. Well, listen, I appreciate you bearing with me through all of the issues that we had in the beginning. Just for our listeners, it took Peter and I about half an hour to get this going, but I think it's been way, way worthwhile, and I'm very grateful for giving up your time, Peter. And maybe we can catch up sometime if we can get up to BC, or if you ever want to come to New Zealand and do some diving. My door is open, sir.
Sounds good, Steve. There's a spare bed here and lots of good diving. Come up and join us, but you'll want to bring your long underwear.
I'll certainly do that. The other side of the country in Bell Island, Newfoundland, I was talking to Jill Hyneth and Gary Dallas about there. So maybe I fly into one coast and go across to the other. It sounds like a good trip.
Well, that sounds great. What's the water temperature there, Steve?
Oh, I think it's pretty cold too. I think it's 4 or 2 or something. So.
Oh, okay.
You're diving with icebergs there.
That's impressive.
Yeah. Maybe while we still can. And yes, I'll need to invest in a heating system and dry gloves and a few other things, I think.
Oh, God, I don't go diving without all that stuff. I can't imagine. I have dual heater batteries.
Oh, wow. I certainly have not figured that out, but that'll be next. Well, thank you very much, mate.
You're more than welcome, Steve. Nice chatting with you.
You've been listening to Speaking Sidemount from www.sidemountpros.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a 5-star review. If there's something you'd like us to cover on the show, then let us know via our Facebook page listed in the podcast notes. Thanks again, and we look forward to you joining us on our next episode of Speaking Sidemount.